Does everyone remember what we talked about last week? Any? The big paternalism, yeah. What was another big takeaway from last week? Relief, rehabilitation, development. Very good. And we also talked about something called asset-based community development, which is something we will talk about again tonight. So we are on our third out of 4 sessions reading and talking through this book called When Helping Hurts. Looks like this. Some of you have a copy. Does each table have at least one copy of this book? Okay, fabulous. And I realize that the last 2 sessions we've had have been very content heavy, and we have not had a ton of time to engage in conversation around the table, so we're going to do that a little bit differently tonight. I'm going to start off with content, just not quite as much, and then I have actually a pretty big and challenging project for you to work on at the end of the session. But let's get started with our very first discussion question. So you're going to talk about this around your table, and I'll bring your scratch paper around so you can write down your answers. But our first discussion question of the night is, how can short-term missions be helpful and hurtful? So answer both. How can they be helpful and how can they be hurtful? And I'm bringing around your scratch paper now. Take about 3 or 4 minutes to answer that. All right, we're going to start over here with table 1. So go ahead and pick your spokesperson to share a little bit about answering that question.
Here's Okay, he can't read, so I will read for us. We said that some things that are helpful are when an experience is set up to learn over just to experience. We also said it can be really good when people are, they stay where they are. Instead of having to go overseas, you kind of see things that are happening in your own community or in your own state or in your own region. That's good because you are able to kind of make an impact where you are. We also said things that are helpful are organizations like Touching Miami with Love, who kind of plan and then they take volunteers and they say, this is what we need, here's how you can help us. So that is what we said. We also said the expense of it all, of traveling and getting there, and especially if it's somewhere overseas for a week or 2, it can sometimes feel like it's more for you than it is for them, is what we said.
Thank you, table 1. Very good. All right, table 2.
I'm afraid we didn't have much time for discussion. We've been having fellowship.
Y'all are busy partying over there.
But we did mention that it's possible that if a mission group goes out and works with someone and then they leave before the full brunt of it has come over to the people. I mean, they haven't really understood and found out exactly what was needed, and then they are left with, what do we do next kind of feeling.
Mm-hmm. The nature of short-term missions is that they are short. Very good. Thanks, table 2.
Table 3 says, it's helpful to the extent that it solves a short-term problem. We can't reach them with the gospel if they're just sitting there starving, and all they can think of is how much their stomach hurts from lack of food. So it's great that we can get in there and solve some short-term problems. Where it's hurtful is that when the short-term mission is done, some might feel like we just turn our backs and walk off, and that can be hurtful to the people that we're trying to reach. So it really needs to be a tandem situation. You have the short-term missions, and then you need the long-term as in the follow-up. And if there is no long-term follow-up, that is not productive.
Thank you. Great job. Table 4.
I'll be speaking tonight for Table 4. The helpful ways were that it meets short-term needs. It's simple as that. There's some things that in the short term, this is answering the question with the question, but can be helpful because the nature of the problem is that it's a short-term need. I can't give an example off the top of the head, but there are some things, I'm not gonna say it again. And then hurtful, it's like granting a wish and then you disappear and don't tell them what to do with their wish. It's like, oh, now you have a house. Well, what do I do with it? I don't have things to help carry on having this thing. And then we were looking at the book and the page where it talks about the scale from the concept of self-individualism to collectivism.
We will be talking
Right.
about that in a minute, yeah.
And just how it can increase the feelings of inferiority in those whose autonomy is taken from them whenever you say, I know what's best for you because I have a short time, I have to do this thing that I came to do. So that's what we got.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. All right, and finally, Table 5.
No, I don't. What? Or we can just start first because we a higher number. We had several of the same things that were said. I think that I'm going to go back to Milligan's point about TML. We go in with an attitude, and I think this is important, of working alongside and working with and not trying to run things for them. And we haven't. I think that we've been successful. We started that early. In fact, we were looking at this book very early in the process of when we started with TML, so that was important. We do provide some extraordinary financial contributions at times, and I think that those are mainly in the form of what would have been referred to last week as relief. That is, it's really hard in the middle of the summer in Miami to ask the community to come together and raise funds to put a new air conditioner unit in the building than what's desperately needed. And to expect that to happen would be to expect children to sit in the heat for months, basically. So I think that we do provide relief as a part of our commitment to TML. Yeah, so we bought them and other things. We bought them water fountains and grills and a number of things. So, but that I think that's the thing that I think that we have had, and it has been a good learning experience, as was mentioned. It has been a good learning experience for everybody in the group, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for the example, tying that back into our work. Good job, Table 5. Good job, everyone. Those were good answers. I want to share with you all a story in the book that starts on page 151. If you read your chapter, you read the story. And this is told by someone who works in the mission field in kind of like an evaluating way, who has had experience in short-term missions, and they're visiting in a community. I hate to call you out, but do you want to sit at a table so you have people to talk to? I'm glad y'all are here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read this. This was said by an African Christian who is speaking to a short-term missionary. And he says, "Elephant and Mouse were best friends. One day, Elephant said, 'Mouse, let's have a party.' Animals gathered from far and near. They ate, they drank, they sang, and they danced. And nobody celebrated more or danced harder than Elephant. After the party was over, Elephant exclaimed, 'Mouse, did you ever go to a better party? What a blast.' But Mouse did not answer. 'Mouse, where are you?' Elephant called. He looked around for his friend and then shrank back in horror. There at Elephant's feet lay Mouse. His little body was ground into the dirt. He'd been smashed by the big feet of his exuberant friend, Elephant. Sometimes that is what it is like to do mission with you Americans, the African storyteller commented. It is like dancing with an elephant. How does that make you feel? I've read that about 5 times and I still got shivers when I read it. So it's a big reality check for us to realize how big we are. And if we don't want to be elephants on the mission field, we have to understand what we are doing to make ourselves so big. Why is it so difficult for us to do short-term mission work well? And it is difficult to do. And I hope that going through this list will show us that it's not our fault that we are like this, but it is our responsibility to address these issues. So we're talking about why are short-term missions hard to do well, and these are 4 factors that I want to talk about. The first one is the mindset that poverty is a deficit. So this is damaging to short-term missions because it emphasizes this giver and receiver model. When you're on a short-term mission trip, you're not spending enough time with the affected community to be able to develop relationally. So why are you there? Is your purpose of going on this trip to improve the lives of the people that you are visiting? And if that's so, you are approaching them in a deficit mindset. And that is one of the biggest mistakes that we make on short-term missions, because why else are you going if not to improve their lives, right? But we'll talk about that in a minute. The next is a product-driven development. So we talked a little bit about this last week, and this ties into the deficit mindset issue. Again, there's not enough time in short-term missions to develop a process, like we talked about, developing a process rather than a product. And then we talked about the difference between relief, rehabilitation, and development. And remember that unless you are in the immediate moment of relief, a product is counterproductive to solving the issue. And when we're approaching short-term missions with a deficit mindset, we have no choice but to be product-driven. That's how those two tie together, and it's a big cycle of making mistake after mistake. Another big issue that we spent a long time talking about last week is paternalism. Remember how bad paternalism can be when we are entering a space or a culture that we don't understand. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about culture clash. So U.S. culture tends to collide with other cultures on 2 fronts, the concept of time and the concept of self. So the concept of time in the U.S. is monochronic, meaning that we see time as a limited and valuable resource. Time can be lost or saved. The best way to be good stewards of our time is to get the most out of every minute. We see this in American work culture, which if you're paying attention to the rest of the developed world, you know that American work culture is grueling. The phrase time is money is true for people at every level of the working class. And now let's compare that to a polychronic view of time, which is the understanding that time is a somewhat unlimited resource. There's always more time. Schedules and plans are guidelines for our day, but they have no authority over how we spend our time. Task-oriented goals are not as important as relationship building, so people in polychronic culture tend to have a deeper sense of community. And this ties in directly to the clash over concept of self. These same people with the polychronic view of time are part of a collectivist culture. These cultures minimize individual identity and instead focus on the well-being of a group. They are loyal, self-sacrificing, and they have deep bonds to people in all different parts of their community. While our culture in the US is increasingly becoming individualistic. And this ties directly into our concept of time because we are focused on individual achievement. What are you best at? How can you live up to your full potential? And this even comes into play when we're doing personal assessments like our spiritual gifts or like our Clifton strengths or our Enneagram or our Myers-Briggs. And those are not bad things. I'm not hating on Clifton strengths. I actually love talking about my Enneagram. It's my favorite thing to talk about. But we do need to recognize that that is culturally specific to us. And the biggest takeaway that I want you to get from looking at this slide is recognizing that the United States is an extreme culture. We are so far on one end of the spectrum, while on the other end of the spectrum are many of the places in the world where we are notorious for practicing paternalism. Do you see how that is a problem? And I pulled this quote from page 157. It says, "It is not long before many of us start to look down on our polychronic brothers and sisters, quickly deciding that they are inept or even lazy, and then the paternalism kicks in." And that is how our concept of time and self directly affect the way that we do missions in other countries.
Question.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
Go ahead.
I just had this thought while you were saying this on the scales. And this is a historical question, and maybe it's just a loose and random thought from my head. Do we see Christianity from our individualistic mindset when in fact it was a faith that was developed in a more collectivist mindset? And so we're not as well committed to community as we should be. Just a thought, and it probably isn't really relevant. But
yeah, so kind of like how does our individualism change our practice of Christianity in this country? That's kind of what you were asking? No? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question to throw in the way that we practice our religion into this spectrum. That's a great conversation point that y'all can have after this. Thank you, Drew. That's a good question. Maybe we'll all answer it next week. Okay, I wanna recommend for you all to take time to go back and read chapter 7 in your book, because I'm gonna skip a little bit for the sake of time. And the second half of this chapter talks about ways to do short-term missions well. But the big highlight I want you to take away from the part that we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about is that short-term mission trips are not intended to solve anything. So if you're going on a short-term mission trip for 2 weeks or 2 months, or the book describes it as anything up to 2 years, your number one job is to learn about their culture. Be a good guest to the people there, experience the good and bad things in their community, and absorb everything you can about what is important to the people that you are visiting, so that when you come home, you can have informed conversations and make informed decisions about future relationships or about the potential of future funding for the people that you're working with. So the goal of short-term missions is exposure and communication. We're not there to solve anything. Does anyone have questions about short-term missions? Because we're going to move on. Okay, wonderful. Yes. A mic is coming at you.
One thing I've experienced is that the more expensive the mission trip, the more driven the participants are to have a product.
Yeah. Yep.
And they get real nervous when they feel like they're not going to be able to produce that product, take the pictures, be able to go home and justify the expense of the trip.
Yep.
And contradicting that in discussion has been challenging through my career anyway.
I bet it has, and that there's a big section on that in chapter 7 as well. If you have the time to go back and read it, talking about spending so much money to go on an international trip. When you come back from that trip, you have to be able to prove to people that you did work there, and that is damaging for the people that you're meeting and leaving behind. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Jim. That was a great point. Okay, so we're going to move on to a second discussion question, and we are shifting topics a little bit. We're going to talk about domestic poverty alleviation, and I've promised the past 2 weeks that we're going to talk about systems, and today we're going to talk about systems. So go ahead and talk at your tables. What systems in our community contribute to material poverty? All right, table 5. You get to go first.
Okay, I'll talk. We just had 2 things. One was lack of functioning and efficient sanitation and water systems can affect poverty, and lack of exposure to new ideas. I mean, John was talking about that back in the age of discovery, you know, Columbus and all that, that certain communities didn't get the benefit of seeing new ideas. Mm-hmm. I guess that's not maybe as widespread now with the internet, because you can find out about any place, anytime, and get new ideas, but only if you have the internet and power and all that, yes.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right, table 4.
So I think we talked about lots of different things. So just in terms of like specific examples of systems, like one of the examples we came up with was this recent story in the AJC about businesses being unable to obtain insurance for their businesses because they were in high crime areas, and it essentially becoming a form of redlining in certain areas. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. We talked about predatory lending and how mm-hmm. that can affect and sort of lead down to sort of spiraling. Healthcare, our healthcare system, we have lots of thoughts on things related to healthcare. I think a sort of theme that came up was maybe in terms of our political system, good ideas being targeted as bad ideas when there's evidence that they're good ideas, and people might even take advantage of them if they understood what they actually did. But because of our political system, targeting an idea is, if you agree with this, then you are not part of our group, then that becomes problematic.
Yeah, great job, thank you. Table 3.
I don't have the answers, Glenn does.
Sometimes when you're going in, to the mission field, and they think that you're really rich and all, that they snub their noses at you and all, and they won't really listen to you, thinking that you're better than they are, which you're not, but that's the impression that they get.
What type of relationship poverty is that person experiencing? Wait, did I just say it? What type of poverty is that person experiencing? It is relationship to self. Low self-esteem, relationship to self.
A relationship is just, that's mental poverty, I guess. So.
Yeah. All right, very good. Thank you, table 3.
Okay.
Jim, Barbara, Lynn?
I really don't think we have anything to add.
Wonderful. Great job, table 2. All right, table 1.
I don't have the notes. I think we listed several things about systems that help continue poverty in situations like it. One of them was the education system, especially the way the United States funds education. It's usually based on like the taxes of homes, like your property taxes. So the wealthier people who pay more in property taxes, then the government for the local situation has more money for the schools. Well, consequently, the lower income schools are in communities which have less income and less base for that. So it's not exactly everyone's equal and equally funded. It's not good. We ought to be against that. What's another one? Transportation. If you don't have public transportation to get to a job, how do you work? And so it's helpful for a community, any community, to have transportation that's geared toward getting people to their homes and also to work. And the American obsession with the automobile is just not helpful for a lot of people who have to go to that extra expense, earn all that money. My goal would be that everyone would be able to bicycle to work who lives in an urban area and to come home alive. You can do this in several countries of the world, and it works. But we don't have the will to do that. We make it very expensive to go to work. What's another one we had? Healthcare was another one, Yeah, education and healthcare both are examples of where you could do better at helping everyone.
Yeah.
The thing about the education is community health. It helps when you've got the people that attend the school, the families, the backup. The people that are from a wealthier neighborhood have people that are more interested in education or have more time. But if you could get, try and get someone in the community. There have been communities that they've bonded together and they've made efforts to help their own communities and their schools through their volunteer efforts. And I think part of that is how much support that school gets.
I just add to that, I think it ties to value systems more than the tax system, because at least in the southern areas, it's a countywide school system. When we moved up north, we found out that school systems were very much subdivided into the townships, and the townships were very different, place to place. But still, even there, the paper in Rochester, New York would even come out and single out, well, this district, Brighton, scored the highest because it is predominantly Jewish, and the Jewish people put a high value on education. What was nice is that East Rochester scored second highest, and it was made up primarily of second-generation Italian who really were looking at ways to get ahead. And of course, again, the inner city came out lowest. And again, it's the fact that they don't value the education or family values sometimes as much as would be more helpful. That's my opinion.
Right. I talking about a value system is absolutely true, but I would also challenge us to think back to how those value systems are formed and what type of poverty causes a certain community or a certain family to lack values of education, for example. Yeah. It started a long time ago. Yes, Nancy.
Jim said education, and so I have to say something. What's in the book may be broadly true, but I don't know that it's always true. I don't know that it's true. It's not true in my county, DeKalb, and it's not all that true in the metro area. Just some things that we do, state of Georgia gets $660 million in federal funds for poverty. So there are extra ways. It's not just your local thing. There are ways that we try to, compensate and overcome that. And then the state of Georgia has $15 billion in its state education funds, but $3 billion of that they take from the not poor districts and give to the poor districts. So I mean, I think there are issues, but there's also some efforts that we don't really know about that are trying to make that. And then one last thing, DeKalb has 77% of its students qualify for a free and reduced lunch, but our local taxes generate $1.13 billion for the 92,000 students. So it's complicated, you know. Even if you try to do your best, the numbers don't always behave like you think they do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. That was a lot of numbers that are spinning around in my head that thank you. The point is that there are things at work that we don't always know about. And the big question is it enough? And what do we do when it's not, I guess. Okay, any other comments? That was really good discussion. Anything else? Okay. We're going to keep talking about systems. As a reminder, this is our model of poverty. Broken relationships, broken systems. This is in contrast to our model of healthy relationships that we looked at a couple times. So in a healthy model, the relationships positively influence the systems, and then the systems work for the sake of the relationship. So everyone who was in worship on Sunday remembers when Lisa was preaching, and she kind of like held her arm up in the air, and she was like, the government is supposed to work for the people. Do you guys remember that? This is what she was talking about. She was talking about this type of model of poverty. But unfortunately, in the case that she was referencing, she was talking about how Congress failed to renew the Farm Bill. And that is a political decision that directly affects farmers, which affects not only their livelihoods, but our food prices, which affects both the families that they serve at Toco Hills and the amount of food that they can receive from the food bank. So there was a political system failure which affects the farmer's relationship to the rest of creation. That's their purpose. It affects the economic system when prices go up, which then affects people's relationship to others when there's scarcity. And then we can go on, and one failure kind of ping-pongs us around this model of poverty, and that's why we see all of those schisms in all those different places all at once because of one decision. Does that make sense how complicated that is? And how when someone like Lisa, who's the executive director of a food pantry, says the government is supposed to work for the people, she is angry about something that seems so simple, protecting farmers so that they can feed people. When the political system fails to do that, it directly affects the work that she does every single day. And that's just one small example. I mean, it's a big thing, but it's a small example of this system malfunctioning. And the reality is that poor people are often at the mercy of systems created by the powerful. I'll say that again. Poor people are at the mercy of systems created by the powerful. So we are now going to have kind of a hard conversation about system failures in our community, and we're going to do our best to remove all political bias from this conversation. I know that's impossible to do. I have political bias, you have political bias, but this is a safe and loving space for conversation, so we disagree with ideas, not with people. And we're going to talk about some system issues that are all referenced in chapter 8 of your book, okay? With that said, the first thing we're going to talk about is racism. So this is a huge factor in our system because of what was going on in our country when these systems were first formed. And the fact that we are living under the same government that was created during the time when white Americans enslaved Africans. And yes, there have obviously been changes to our laws since the time when slavery was a legal practice, but there has not been enough equitable change to rid our systems of the evil of slavery. We can pinpoint places in our system that are intentionally oppressive, and there are also places that are unintentionally oppressive. And remember that this system was formed to work for our relationships. So because of our country's history, not everyone is necessarily included in that group of people who the systems are supposed to be working for. So racism is a huge reason why these systems have been flawed since day one. And you can tell a very similar story about sexism as well. Now, getting into the actual systems that I want to talk about, education, which many of you have said already. This is access to education based on poverty level and location. This is the importance or lack of importance of education within a family system. This is inadequate funding for schools, inadequate pay for teachers, and inadequate teacher training, which is a big deal, specifically in an inner city public school context. This is education and training for people in the job force and how expensive it is to become qualified to do something. This is student debt, which I have a lot of because my family couldn't afford college or grad school. And the hot button issue now is that we can't even agree on what our kids should be learning about in school. So education is a broken system in our community. Wealth is a broken system. Some people have too much money. A whole lot of people have not enough money. We talked a little bit about wealth hoarding in our first session. So for the materially poor, they are focused on income. That's the flow of revenue that's coming in. And because that revenue flows out so quickly, there is never the opportunity to accumulate wealth. Now remember, wealth accumulation is good. Wealth hoarding, which is basically too much wealth accumulation, is bad. So how did this system become such a failure? And a big answer to this is technological advances that were intended to increase both wealth and time, or both wealth of time and money for people in the working class, but they ended up only increasing wealth for people in the wealthy class. When we create technology to do work for a laborer, that laborer is supposed to then work less while making the same amount of money or more. But because technology is owned by a corporation, all of the extra wealth goes to the corporation while they are able to hire fewer workers, therefore spending less money, and force those workers to work as long and as hard as they want them to for as little pay as they can get away with, because people in the working class are desperate for jobs, which are now fewer because of technology. It's a very complicated way where the rich get richer and poor are experiencing more and more scarcity of their necessary resources for survival. And this began with the invention of something that was supposed to help the working class. So, the wealth system is broken. Housing. We are all well aware that the cost of owning a home or paying rent is unreasonably high compared to the average income. And I'm going to use myself as an example because this is a broken system that has a very real effect on my life. I am an almost 29-year-old with no kids. I have a 3-year master's degree and a full-time job in my career field. I'm making a little under the average income for my area. I'm living in the cheapest one-bedroom apartment I could find that meets my personal safety and commute requirements, and I'm spending about 50% of my income on living expenses. So this doesn't sound like a big deal. But in order to maintain that for a long period of time while accumulating wealth, you don't want to be spending more than about 33% of your income on living expenses. So I, and literally millions of other people in our country, experience something called being house poor, which typically refers to when you own a home that you can't afford, but it can also just mean that your living expenses take up too much of your income. So you have to spend less money elsewhere, or you go without, and it drastically decreases your ability to accumulate wealth. And I use myself as an example to show you that even people who are financially okay and who are functioning members of society are deeply affected by the broken housing system. And it's also a big reason why people my age are having fewer kids or not having kids at all, because we can't afford them. Living is simply too expensive. On the extreme end of the housing crisis, we know that there are hardworking people in our community with less generational wealth, less access to education, and fewer job opportunities who have no hope of affording somewhere to live. The housing system is broken, and once again, that ping-pongs us around this poverty model. And finally, healthcare. We're talking about access to doctors, access to affordable medication. We're talking about unreasonable health insurance premiums, lack of access to health insurance. I'm not going to dive too deeply into this, partly because I know that everyone has their own stories with the healthcare system, and we understand how hard it is to navigate. And also, this book was written in a time when our access to healthcare looked just a little bit different. So you're welcome to read more about that in chapter 8. But within these broken systems, because this is where we live, nothing is going to change today or tomorrow, maybe one day, God willing. This leaves us with two big questions. What do people need, and what are we going to do about it? People need the ability to make a living wage at whatever job they have. They need the education and resources to manage their own money and make enough money with enough management resources to be able to accumulate wealth. And people need access to quality education, housing, and healthcare. And by people, I mean everyone, regardless of race, gender, class, sexual orientation, family history, property ownership, and any other way that you can categorize a human being. In order to be a functional member of society, everyone needs and deserves these things. With that said, we are but one church in the middle of one city, in one state, in one country in this world. What in the world are we supposed to do about it? So for the rest of the evening, which, gosh, I was trying to leave you guys more time, we're going to talk about it. So I'm going to read this. Man, I really thought we'd have more time. I'm so sorry. I have brought a new situation for you to think about. And let me just read it to you very quickly. The Ahmed family fled their war-torn country and now live in a small apartment in Garden Hills. The parents, Ali and Fatima, were skilled professionals in their home country, but in their new country, they struggle to find work due to language barriers and unrecognized credentials. Ali now works as a day laborer, and Fatima takes care of their young children at home. The family faces discrimination, isolation, and difficulties adjusting to the new culture. Their children are also struggling in school due to the language barrier and trauma from their past experiences. So I'm going to bring this scenario around to your table so you can read it up close. But while I'm doing that, you're going to think about what systems are failing here. You can think about the circle of systems in our model of poverty. You can think about the things that I listed. What systems are failing here? And then, if we have time, you can work on asset mapping. What assets do they have already? And we're going to bring ourselves into this in a productive way. What assets does our church have? This is a family that moved into an apartment in our neighborhood. What assets does our church have? Not to give them things or tell them what they need or ask them what's wrong with you, right? Like we talked about last week. But what are ways that we can work in development with them? And what are the first 3 steps that we would take as a congregation in developing something to alleviate their poverty? Okay, lots of questions and you have like 4 minutes, so talk. All right, I'm going to interrupt you because it's 7. I'm going to pray for us. If you are deep in good conversation, I invite you to hang out and finish it, but I'm going to go ahead and pray us out for tonight. Let's pray. God, thank you so much for these people and for their willingness to have hard conversations and to put our differences aside to be able to discuss the best practices of doing what Jesus taught us to do, which is to love our neighbors. Be with us as we leave this space. Be with us as we are watching the weather in Florida and praying for our neighbors down there. Help us to know the right moves. Help us to listen to your guidance and to act in wisdom and grace. Bring us back together again next week to finish out this series. And I want to ask us a special blessing on whatever we accomplish through doing this together, whether it just be conversation, whether we are encouraged to do something, to take action, whether we are discouraged by the problems that we face in this world. Please bless whatever comes out of this and help it be fruitful to your will. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.